When looking at the meta of the top GOAT decks, we see a few recurring patterns. Firstly, we see a lot of flip monsters that can either recur cards from the graveyard or search for cards from the deck to gain card advantage. In addition to this, we also find cards that want to be in the graveyard or cards that benefit from other cards being in the graveyard. As such, to combat this meta, you always need cards that can deal with these two elements, that can nullify flip effects and can deal with the graveyard. With GOAT control, and in particular Chaos, dominating the format over the years, several anti-meta decks have risen up to combat them, the most prominent of which being the appropriately named anti-meta warriors, which I will cover in a later video. However, today we're looking at a more underrated deck that can counter the meta, Gravekeepers. Now, before talking about Gravekeepers as a deck, I'd like to take a moment to talk about how important this deck is in regards to the game's history. This is the first real archetype as we know them today in Yu-Gi-Oh history. Sure, we had decks like Harpies that had a few support cards, but they were never good enough or cohesive enough to make a deck around them until much later. Gravekeepers, by comparison, consists of many of the elements we associate with decks nowadays. It has an archetypal searcher, several spell and trap cards designed to recur or search for archetypal cards, and of course a powerful field spell. Usually I begin these videos by talking about the monsters of the deck, then moving on to the spells and traps. However, as this deck is so reliant on it, let's begin by looking at the field spell, Necro Valley. Necro Valley is a field spell whose original non-errated text says, increase the attack and defense of all Gravekeepers by 500 points. Cards cannot be moved from graveyards. Now the reason I'm bringing that up is that this card has been rewritten more than any other card in Yu-Gi-Oh history. I'll discuss the point boost of this card when talking about the monsters, but for now let's discuss the anti-graveyard ability. Essentially, Necro Valley makes graveyards and any effects involving them useless. In case you're unfamiliar with GOAT format, let me run down all the ways this card screws with many of the top tier metagame strategies. Firstly, this card makes Chaos monsters totally useless, as it's impossible to banish cards from graveyards under it. This makes two of the format's most powerful monsters, Chaos Sorcerer and BLS, essentially bricks. It also shuts down cards like Magician of Faith, Pixie Knight and Mask of Darkness from being able to recur spells and traps from your graveyard. It makes Premature Burial, Shallow Grave and Call of the Haunted useless, and it makes Graceful Charity a much worse card, as discarding the two cards from your hand no longer has any value. Finally, it also makes setting up the Banish Zone for cards like Dimension Fusion and Return from the Dimension a lot harder. Also, I guarantee that if you face an opponent who has rarely played GOAT or has rarely played against Gravekeepers, they will at least once waste an effect while the Valley is active. I can't count the amount of times someone has flipped a Magician of Faith or activated Call of the Haunted only to realise that under Necro Valley they do nothing. It's super funny and super satisfying to pull off. So to recap, that's the top deck of the format utterly crippled and 3 of the other top decks severely neutered. While its power has definitely diminished over the years, I think it's fair to call Necro Valley one of the first great floodgates in Yu-Gi-Oh history. Also, if you think that little boost isn't that much, just wait till we get to the monster lineup. Let's start with the best of the Gravekeepers, Gravekeepers Spy, which we run a full playset of. A monster with 1200 attack points and 2000 defense points, she has the ability to search for any Gravekeeper with 1500 or less attack when flipped and put it right onto the field. Now, before we even talk about how good this effect is, let me just say that any monster with 2000 defense points is very hard to run over in GOAT format. In fact, there are very few monsters that can beat this in battle, which are the Chaos monsters, which are very hard to bring out against Necro Valley, the addition of Chaos, and the Monarchs. Also, with Necro Valley's boost, there's almost a 0% chance this monster's going to get beaten in battle. Now, there are other ways people are going to remove this, like Mystic Swordsman level 2, King Tiger Wangu, and some Monarchs like Zaborg and Gamag, but it's safe to say that the Spy will stick around for a while, coming up the board and protecting you from attacks. In addition to this, the Spy can put a very powerful keeper onto the board, be it another Spy or Guard for increasing your defense, or one of the deck's powerful attackers like Gravekeepers Assailant and Gravekeepers Spear Soldier. Next, let's take a look at the 2 offensive monsters of Gravekeepers, Gravekeepers Spear Soldier and Gravekeepers Assailant. Now, Necro Valley is how we deal with Chaos, but these 2 monsters are how we deal with GOAT control, as both of these are great ways of dealing with small defensive monsters, with Spear Soldier being just a straight up piercer that can do between 15 and 2000 damage, depending on if Necro Valley is in the field, and Assailant having the ability to turn GOAT tokens into attack mode. These guys with Necro Valley will slice through GOAT tokens and the opponent's life total very fast. For our final Gravekeeper, we have Gravekeepers Guard. Like Spy, Guard has a powerful wall that with Necro Valley becomes near unbeatable in battle. However, while Spy improves our own field, Gravekeepers Guard deals with our opponent's monsters by bouncing them back to the hand. This has several applications, such as clearing ways for attacks or saving one of our monsters from a future attack, but it can also do great at giving us a tempo advantage. For example, if playing as a Monarch deck or a deck that has managed to get BLS out, bouncing that card not only takes a threat off the board, it makes it much more difficult for them to redeploy it next turn, as they may not have the setup they had to bring it out the first time. So this card can both push our attack and slow our opponents down at the same time. Before moving on to the last monster we've played in this deck, I think I should highlight a Gravekeeper I'm not running, Gravekeepers Chief. The only tribute monster in this archetype, the Chief has two effects. Firstly, your graveyard is unaffected by Necro Valley. Now this effect is mostly useless, as no Gravekeeper deck worth its salt would ever play cards that their field spell would render useless, on the small chance they draw this thing. His second effect, however, can be useful, as it allows the Chief to bring back another Keeper when summoned. Which, yes, I know makes the first effect somewhat useful, but oftentimes it will just be dead. This effect essentially allows you to play him for free, as you can bring back the monster you sacrificed or any other of the 9 or 12 keepers run in this deck. However, I don't run him because oftentimes he can be a brick. For example, this card is a perfect example of a win more card, in that if you're already ahead, he'll push you further ahead, but if your board's been wiped, he will do nothing. For the only non-archetypal playset in this deck, we have Tsukiomi, a spirit with 1100 attack points. It's not part of the archetype, but given how much synergy it has with the rest of the deck, it may as well be. On summon, Tsuk will flip one monster face down. Also, like all spirit, it will bounce itself back to the hand at the end step and can't be special summoned. When playing this card, we have two options of how to use it. The most obvious use of this card is to reuse cards like Spy and Guard's flip effects, giving us multiple searches, multiple bouncers, etc. However, this card can also be used in an offensive manner. When you look at the staples of GOAT format, like Breaker the Magical Warrior, Tribe Infecting Virus, Berserk Gorilla, Most Warriors, etc., we see they all have fairly low defense points and can easily be run over in defense mode by cards like Spear Soldier and Assailant. So in the rest of those senses, Tsuk can be double as a repeatable removal piece and a repeatable Book of Moon. Finally, this card is one of our deck's only ways of breaking out of a 1000 Eyes Restrict lock, as summoning this and flipping the Restrict face down means our Gravekeepers can then just beat over it. Moving on to our spells, let's begin with our 3 copies of Terraforming to complement our 3 copies of Necro Valley. Yeah, because having 3 copies of the best field spell at the time in our deck wasn't good enough. Let's have 6. Yeah, there's a reason Terraforming is at 1 today. Next, we have our protective spells, My Body as a Shield and Book of Moon. The Gravekeeper monsters are the win condition of this deck, but with so few of them and with our deck not being able to run most revival cards, like Premature Burial and Call of the Haunted due to Necro Valley, it's vitally important to keep these monsters on the field for as long as possible. We'll start with Book of Moon, as it's the more well known of the 2 cards. Fundamentally, it's the same effect as Tsukiomi, allowing us to flip a monster to face down defense position, so all the pros there also apply here. However, Book has one major advantage over the Spirit, and that being that it's a quick play card. This makes it far more powerful and versatile compared to Tsukiomi. Here are a few things the book can do for us that Tsukiomi can't. Firstly, it can save monsters from field wipes and targeted removal. The 2 most played board wipes in GOAT format, Lightning Vortex and Mirror Force, only hit face-up attack position monsters, which makes Book a great way to save a valuable monster, and also ties to the next benefit of Book. It allows you to quickly rebuild after your field has been wiped if it targets a Spy, as what you can do is flip said Spy in response to a Mirror Force or Vortex, and then next you can flip it back up and search for another Gravekeeper, thus essentially rebuilding your board, as most GOAT players don't tend to play more than 2 monsters at a time anyway, due to Mirror Force. For similar reasons as Book, we also run My Body as a Shield. You may remember this card from back in Zodiac format, and it serves a very simple purpose here of protecting our valuable monsters. For the cost of 1500 life points, this card protects a monster or monsters from being destroyed by card effects. Now the life point cost may seem high, but as we're an aggro deck, we really don't care since we're likely to either kill our opponent or die ourselves before that kind of life point loss becomes relevant, and it's worth it for the protection this card offers. as this card not only protects our monsters from effects like Raigeki Break, but also from board wipes like Mirror Force, as the card doesn't specify targeting, only the effect has to destroy a monster or monsters. Also, this card allows us an out to one of the best counters to our deck, Nobleman of Crossout. As this deck relies heavily on its flip monsters like Spy and Guard, the last thing we want is to have those cards extracted from our deck via Nobleman's effect. That can be debilitating, if not outright crippling to this deck. So as such, if you see a Crossout, don't hesitate to flip one of these against it. Speaking of Nobleman, we of course run 2 ourselves as a way of dealing with flip monsters. And concluding our spell and trap lineup, we have of course the Trinity, aka Pot of Greed, Graceful Charity and Delinquent Duo. I mean, what do I need to say about these? We have the 2 best draw cards in the format, and the best hand attack card in the format. Why wouldn't we run these? Finally, let's discuss our trap cards. Let's start with Gravekeepers Right, an archetypal monster reborn, that we have to use because Call of the Haunted and Premature Burial obviously do not work if Necro Valley is on the board. Next in our trap lineup, we have Solemn Judgment. I went over this already in my zombie video, so I'll be brief here. We're an aggressive deck, so we don't really care if our life total's low, and being able to stop any card we want is so powerful in this deck. Next in our suite of interactive traps, we have Compulsory Evacuation Device and Sakuratsu Armor. Now, Sakuratsu Armor is a staple in a lot of GOAT decks as it can destroy one attacking monster. However, Compulse I think is actually better in this deck in particular, because while it doesn't destroy a monster, only bouncing it, it's more versatile as it can also bounce cards like Spy and Guard for us to reuse their effects. Finally, we run the GOAT format staples of Ring of Destruction, Torrential Tribute and Mirror Force, as they're the best board wipes and single target removal traps we have in the format. We don't run Call of the Haunted of course because it conflicts with Necro Valley, and that's it for the trap lineup. In terms of our side deck, we run 3 copies of Kaiku the Ghost Destroyer as an extra answer to Chaos, Chiron the Mage and 7 Tools the Bandit as more back row removal, as well as a couple of Dust Tornadoes. And we also can potentially run Royal Oppression, which, while not as powerful in GOAT as it is in later formats due to less special summoning, can be a good answer to Chaos and possibly zombies as well. While not quite a tier 1 deck, Gravekeepers is definitely one of the most powerful decks in GOAT format, with the ability to contend with the top 3 of Chaos, Warrior and GOAT control. This deck may not be winning you every game, but it'll damn sure help you put up a good fight against these kind of decks. Thank you all for watching, I'll see you guys in the next video.